right, the last bit we're going to go over is what instruction might look like for these individuals with ID. Just the basic instructional principles you're going to want to remember is that you're going to want to initiate some kind of language intervention early in their development. And so if they don't already have that as a related resource, that's something you would want to advocate for. You want to provide intervention to increase speech intelligibility, again, through the help of a speech-language pathologist, and access language in a variety of communication contexts to determine their language goals for intervention. You need to consider possibly at times AAC or augmentative or alternative communication, which that's a whole chapter we're going to go over, but just other ways to communicate. Often people associate AAC with a speech generating device, like a Dynavox or something, but lots of different visuals count as AAC. And one of the last things to consider is that these kids often have a hard time with middle ear infections. Really, all kids do. 2/3 of kids have ear infections before they're 3. But with their different structure, like just physiologically, they might have even more middle ear infections. And that can lead to hearing loss, which can also contribute to speech and language issues. And so these really are things you're going to think about as a special ed teacher in general. But you just want to make sure with these kids you remember that they are delayed, but that there is a possibility for them to catch up. They don't have to stay delayed. And so you want to make sure you're proactive in your time with them, as well as getting any services that would help their language and speech development. There's some specific instructional approaches, and these are listed on pages 114 through 116 in your book. They include constant time delay, direct instruction, discrete trial training, incidental teaching, interrupted behavior chain, and the manned model procedure. I want to talk about a couple of specific ones. I encourage you to go in your book, but I wanted to talk about discrete trial training because I believe we've talked about this. I know we'll talk about it again. This is a principle of ABA, but this just means a lot of repetition and reinforcement. So if you're working on a word, you're just focusing on that one word and you do multiple trials in a row and you reinforce them every time, whether it's a sticker or an M&M, and it's just repetition, and it's what you would think of if you think you're going to drill someone, like on flashcards. And it doesn't have to be flashcards, but it's just that idea that you're repeating. It's very repetitive, one thing, and you're just doing it over and over and over. There's a lot of research that supports that. It's not how you want to do it all the time because it can be tedious for you and the child, but why it is a specific instructional approach for this population is because when we talk about intellectual or learning disability, one thing we always talk about is they need much more repetition. I have heard, like, if a neurotypical child needs to hear something 7 times to get it, a child with a disability might need to hear it 300 times. So again, you can see why it's delayed, because the other kids might hear it 7 times by the time they're 3, but they might not hear it 300 times till they're 10, and then that's when they get it. And so even though it's tedious, procedures like discrete trial training, there has to be a lot of productions. And I think sometimes when we're teaching, whether it's a language skill or just an academic skill, you have so many things that you're trying to get into a 10 or 15 minute one-on-one table time with them. And I just really encourage you to do 1 or 2 things and use this discrete trial method of drill and incorporate it into your routines in different times, because they need repetition. They really need repetition. And then incidental teaching, that is more of what I have mentioned before too, and I highly encourage you to do because of research, and that is to kind of follow their lead and make it as naturalistic as possible. So this is funny, right? Because I'm just telling you to sit there and drill with them. And the next time I'm like, do it through play, do it naturalistic. It has to be a balance, okay? The reality is they need the repetition. But if, on the other hand, then you need to balance your curriculum and your instruction with these naturalistic approaches and opportunities for them to generalize their skill and practice it in a way that's going to be naturally reinforcing to them. I encourage you to go read some more specific things about these instructional approaches. These are not unique to intellectual disability at all, but I wanted to point out a couple there. We're not going to do this since we're not together. But what had happened is, what I had asked you to do originally was to develop a interrupted behavior chain method, or an example of how you can use the interrupted behavior chain method. So here's an example of that, and then we're going to move on. You are going to first identify the current behavior that you're working on. So let's say that you've already taught them how to actually get the drink from the water fountain. What you want to teach them is to request a drink through a picture. So they need to hand you the picture of a drink so they can go get their drink at the water fountain. So if you're using the interrupted behavior model, then you would say, child goes to take a drink from the water. He is prompted, what do you want? And prompted to point the picture of water on the communication board. And then he's reinforced. So instead of first teaching the new skill, you start with the skill they already know. This is very powerful because they do something correct, and that is the momentum they need to keep going. So instead of sitting at the table and trying to get them to request the water and then going to the water fountain, one way you could teach it is while they're at the water fountain, something they already know how to do, you could ask again, hey, what did you want? You wanted a drink? And then you help them understand, oh, that's what this card means. You want a drink. And they use it and they get reinforced again with the skill they know, drinking from the water fountain. So it's a really powerful instructional technique. Again, if you're just thinking about trying to build on things they can do, starting with a thing they can do and interrupting that and with the new skill instead of starting with the new skill. Read more on that. Okay, the last bit of this is what I'm always going to try and do is give you this big picture, right? We know that we want them to do these things, but they need to do them outside of your classroom. You know, they need to do them in every room in the school during lunch and recess and specials. Beyond that, they need to do it at home, and beyond that, they need to do it in the community, and beyond that, they need to do it as adults. So it has to be, you have to start with the end in mind, and sometimes that's really hard in special education because you drill down to the need, so you kind of start at the beginning, right, developmentally, yet we have to keep this big picture. Like if we do all of this, but we don't figure out how to enhance the generalization of the skill, it's kind of all for nothing. So this is what goes back to incidental teaching. Difficulties with generalization can be reduced if children are taught in the setting in which they will need the skill they are learning. So if a child's practicing approaching peers for conversation, I would encourage you to figure out, you might model it and practice in the classroom, but where you really need to do it is where they want to approach a peer for conversation. Maybe that's at the lunch table, maybe that's at recess, and teaching it and practicing it in that environment shows greater generalization of the skill. Other ways, like I just said, you're going to start using different people. You don't want to always, even if they're in a group, you know, they always come with this other kid during that time to your room to practice. You want to give them other partners because sometimes unintentionally they begin to think, oh, I know how to do it with this kid, but I don't know how to do it with this other kid. And so you want to practice who they're doing it with. You really want to focus on the skills that are actually in demand in the natural environment. One thing that I've talked to people about, and I remember thinking this was interesting, sometimes people teach kids to shake hands. I'm not against shaking hands. I think it's an appropriate skill and in the right setting, right? If they're going for a job interview or maybe they're at church. But like, why would we teach this lesson of shaking someone's hand and asking their name to a second grader? Because that's not what other kids are doing. So we're trying to get them to fit in, or I don't always like saying it that way. Um, we're trying to make it a comfortable and successful interaction for them, right? So if other kids aren't like reaching out to shake their hand, we don't want to be teaching them. And somebody told me once, like, you know, we don't want all these kids to turn into like middle-aged women in their habits, because that's who teachers typically are, not always. But it's like, the way that a 35-year-old woman might interact is not what we need to teach a kid. We have to really think about the skill they need in their natural environment and then practice them in those real environments. All right, guys, that's really it. If you have questions, email me. Please email me, call me, set up a meeting with me in my office. You still have assignments due. You have your Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 quiz due by next Monday, and you have your language sample and analysis. I'm available to you this week. Late Sunday night or late in the day Monday when I'm working, I might not be able to, so that's really on you to make sure you have your stuff together. But I am available to you. What else? I really hope, aside from like being sucked up by aliens or something, I feel like I'm going to jinx it if I say see you next week, because that keeps not happening. But I really hope I'll see you next week to go over Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is a special chapter to me because it's over autism, and that's what I've spent the last couple years really specializing in. And it's a very prevalent diagnosis, and so I'm glad to get to talk to you about it and how language, what it looks like, what their language skills often look like, because I know you'll encounter these individuals in your schools. So that's it. Make sure you get a hold of me if you need anything at all, and I'm crossing my fingers. See you next week.